Picture this. You're 17 years old, standing outside the most prestigious university in the country, clutching a portfolio that represents 4 years of sleepless nights, countless competitions won, and dreams bigger than the sprawling campus before you. You've earned every right to be there. Your grades are flawless. Your achievements speak louder than words ever could. But in 15 minutes, you'll discover that none of that matters when the person across the desk has already decided you don't belong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a brilliant young man whose encounter with institutional bias would shake the foundations of American higher education and expose uncomfortable truths about privilege, power, and the price of silence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone pathways of Whitmore University, one of the most elite institutions on the East Coast. Founded in 1847, its Gothic spires and ivy-covered walls had witnessed the education of presidents, Supreme Court justices, and titans of industry. The campus breathed old money and older traditions, where family legacies stretched back generations and admission often felt more like inheritance than achievement. Marcus Thompson walked through the ornate iron gates at exactly 8:30 a.m., his black leather messenger bag slung over his shoulder, containing what he hoped would be his ticket to a future beyond his wildest dreams. At 17, Marcus carried himself with a quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from years of proving himself in rooms where he was often the only face that looked like his. His sneakers made soft sounds against the ancient stones as he navigated the winding paths toward the admissions building. Students hurried past him, most carrying designer backpacks and discussing weekend plans at family estates in the Hamptons or skiing trips to Aspen. Marcus observed their casual wealth with neither envy nor resentment, but with the analytical mind that had earned him recognition as one of the top young innovators in the country. The Whitmore campus was a world unto itself, isolated from the bustling city of Boston by carefully manicured grounds and an unspoken understanding that this was sacred space, reserved for a select few. Every building told a story of exclusivity, from the marble steps worn smooth by decades of privileged footsteps to the bronze plaques honoring donors whose names graced libraries, dormitories, and entire academic departments. Marcus paused outside Harrison Hall, the imposing structure that housed the admissions office. The building's facade was adorned with carved stone figures representing the liberal arts, their faces weathered but still proud after more than a century of watching over the institution. He checked his phone. 8:45 a.m. His interview was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. This wasn't just any interview. Marcus was here for the Pemberton Foundation Scholarship, a full-ride opportunity that covered not only tuition, room, and board, but also provided a substantial stipend for research and study abroad programs. Only 5 students nationwide were selected each year, and the scholarship had launched the careers of some of the most influential leaders in science, technology, and public service. As Marcus climbed the stone steps, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Growing up in Detroit's East Side, he had watched his neighborhood struggle with disinvestment, factory closures, and the slow drain of opportunity. But instead of becoming discouraged, Marcus had found inspiration in the resilience of his community. His grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, always told him that brilliance had no zip code. She was right. By age 14, Marcus had already developed a prototype for a water filtration system that could provide clean drinking water in areas affected by industrial contamination. The design caught the attention of environmental engineers at the University of Michigan, who invited him to present his work at a national conference. That presentation led to a patent, which led to recognition from the Environmental Protection Agency, which eventually led to this moment. The scholarship application process had been rigorous. Marcus had submitted his academic transcripts, showing a perfect 4.0 GPA, despite attending an underfunded public school where textbooks were outdated and science equipment was often broken. He had included documentation of his 17 patents, his published research papers, and letters of recommendation from professors, industry leaders, and community advocates who had witnessed his potential firsthand. But statistics and achievements only told part of Marcus's story. What the application couldn't capture was the nights he spent in his grandmother's small apartment, working by lamplight because the electricity had been turned off, using recycled materials to build prototypes because new supplies were beyond their budget. It couldn't convey the determination that drove him to bike 12 miles to the public library every day after school, because it was the only place with reliable internet access. The Pemberton Foundation Scholarship represented more than financial aid to Marcus. It was validation that merit could triumph over circumstance, that innovation and dedication were valued above social connections and family wealth. The scholarship had a legendary reputation for selecting students who would go on to change the world, and Marcus had dreamed of joining that legacy since he first learned about the program 3 years ago. Inside Harrison Hall, the atmosphere was hushed and reverent. The lobby featured dark wood paneling, Persian rugs, and oil paintings of distinguished alumni whose stern faces seemed to judge everyone who entered. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled gray hair and a Hermes scarf, looked up as Marcus approached her mahogany desk. "Good morning," Marcus said politely. "I'm here for a 9 a.m. interview with the Pemberton Foundation Scholarship Committee. My name is Marcus Thompson." The receptionist's fingers clicked across her keyboard as she searched for his appointment. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly as she found his file, a micro-expression that Marcus caught but couldn't quite interpret. "Yes, I see you here," she said, her voice professionally neutral. "Please have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Marcus settled into one of the leather chairs, arranged around a coffee table laden with glossy brochures showcasing Whitmore's academic programs and campus life. He opened his messenger bag and reviewed his notes one final time, though he had memorized every detail of his presentation. His research on sustainable urban development was groundbreaking, proposing innovative solutions for cities struggling with climate change, economic inequality, and infrastructure decay. As he waited, other candidates began arriving for their interviews. Marcus observed them with the same analytical attention he applied to his scientific work. There was a young woman with perfectly straightened blonde hair, designer clothes, and the confident bearing of someone who had never doubted her place in elite circles. A young man followed, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Marcus's family spent on groceries in 3 months. Each new arrival was greeted warmly by the receptionist, who seemed to recognize many of them by name. "Oh, Stephanie, how are your parents? I heard about your father's appointment to the Federal Reserve. James, wonderful to see you again. Did your family enjoy the fundraising gala last month?" The casual familiarity between the staff and other candidates created an atmosphere that felt increasingly foreign to Marcus. These weren't just students competing for a scholarship. They were part of an extended community, a network of families and relationships that had been cultivated over generations. Marcus began to understand that his competition wasn't just academic or intellectual. It was social and cultural in ways he had never fully appreciated. At 8:58 a.m., a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit emerged from a corridor lined with faculty offices. Dr. Richard Blackwood was the Dean of Admissions at Whitmore, a position he had held for nearly 2 decades. His silver hair was styled conservatively, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to making decisions that shaped the trajectories of young lives. "Stephanie Morrison," Dr. Blackwood called out, and the blonde woman Marcus had observed earlier stood gracefully and followed him down the hallway. Marcus noted the warmth in Dr. Blackwood's voice, the way he placed a guiding hand on Stephanie's shoulder as they walked, the comfortable conversation that began before they even reached the interview room. 20 minutes later, Stephanie emerged with a radiant smile, shaking Dr. Blackwood's hand with obvious satisfaction. The next candidate, James, was called in with similar warmth and familiarity. The pattern continued through the morning. Each candidate was greeted like a welcomed guest. Interviews ran precisely on schedule, and everyone seemed to be part of an invisible understanding that Marcus couldn't quite grasp. By 10:30 a.m., Marcus realized he was the only candidate remaining in the waiting area. His interview had been scheduled for 9 a.m., but no one had acknowledged the delay or offered an explanation. The receptionist had taken several personal phone calls, organized files, and even stepped away for an extended coffee break, all while Marcus sat patiently, checking his phone and growing increasingly concerned. Finally, at 10:45 a.m., Dr. Blackwood reappeared in the lobby. His demeanor was noticeably different from what Marcus had observed with the previous candidates. Where there had been warmth and welcome, there was now professional distance. Where there had been engaging conversation, there was now silence. "Marcus Thompson?" Dr. Blackwood's voice was clipped, efficient. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, standing quickly and extending his hand. Dr. Blackwood shook it briefly, without the lingering connection Marcus had witnessed with the others. I apologize for the delay. We're running behind schedule today. The explanation felt hollow, especially since Marcus had watched each previous interview conclude punctually. As they walked down the hallway, Marcus attempted to engage in the kind of preliminary conversation he had observed between Dr. Blackwood and the other candidates. Thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Blackwood. Whitmore has been my dream school since I started high school. Dr. Blackwood responded without looking back. The interview room was elegant but intimidating, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the campus quad and a conference table that could seat 12 people. 5 individuals were already seated, each representing different aspects of the Pemberton Foundation Selection Committee. Dr. Blackwood as Dean of Admissions, Professor Elizabeth Hartwell from the Engineering Department, Dr. Michael Pemberton III, great-grandson of the Foundation's founder, Ms. Catherine Prescott from the Development Office, and Dr. Amanda Richards, the Faculty Senate representative. Marcus took the single chair, positioned at the head of the table, feeling suddenly isolated, despite having prepared for this moment for months. The committee members shuffled through papers and files, creating an atmosphere of busy distraction rather than focused attention. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Blackwood began, glancing at his watch. We have limited time today, so let's proceed efficiently. Can you briefly summarize your academic achievements and explain why you believe you deserve the Pemberton Foundation Scholarship? The question was standard, but the delivery felt perfunctory, as if the answer didn't particularly matter. Marcus had expected a more collaborative dialogue, the kind of intellectual exchange he had witnessed in academic conferences and research presentations. Instead, the atmosphere felt more like an interrogation than an exploration of his potential. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Despite the unwelcoming environment, Marcus launched into his presentation with the passion and precision that had earned him recognition across the country. He spoke about his water filtration innovations, his research on urban sustainability, his plans to use advanced engineering to address environmental justice issues in underserved communities. He outlined specific projects he hoped to pursue at Whitmore, professors he wanted to work with, and ways the Pemberton Scholarship would enable him to expand his impact. As Marcus spoke, he noticed that several committee members were not paying attention. Professor Hartwell was reviewing other documents. Ms. Prescott was typing on her phone. Dr. Pemberton III seemed more interested in the view outside the window than in Marcus's groundbreaking research. Only Dr. Richards appeared to be listening intently, occasionally nodding or taking notes. Her engagement gave Marcus hope and encouraged him to continue with enthusiasm despite the overall lack of engagement from the panel. Your technical work is certainly interesting, Dr. Blackwood said when Marcus concluded his presentation. The word interesting hung in the air with a dismissive quality that made Marcus's stomach tighten. Professor Hartwell looked up from her papers. Marcus, can you tell us about your family background? What do your parents do? The question felt loaded with implications Marcus couldn't fully understand. My parents passed away when I was 12, he replied. I've been raised by my grandmother, who worked as a nurse's aide before retiring. The committee members exchanged glances. Dr. Pemberton III leaned forward slightly. And your financial situation? We qualify for need-based aid, Marcus answered honestly. The Pemberton Scholarship would make it possible for me to attend Whitmore without placing a financial burden on my grandmother. How do you think you would fit into the Whitmore community? Miss Prescott asked, her tone suggesting that she had already formed an opinion. Marcus had prepared for this question, understanding that academic excellence was only one component of the evaluation. I believe diversity of perspective strengthens any community. My experiences growing up in Detroit, working with limited resources, and developing solutions for real-world problems would bring a unique viewpoint to classroom discussions and research collaborations. The response was met with silence. Dr. Blackwood made a note in Marcus's file, then looked up with an expression that seemed to signal the conclusion of the interview. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Blackwood said, we appreciate you taking the time to visit Whitmore today. The selection process is highly competitive, and we receive applications from many qualified candidates. The dismissive tone was unmistakable. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this interview had been different from what he had expected and different from what the other candidates had experienced. But he maintained his composure, thanking the committee for their time and expressing his continued interest in Whitmore. As Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to leave, Dr. Richards stood and walked around the table. "Marcus," she said quietly, "your research is truly impressive. The work you've done on water filtration systems could have tremendous applications in addressing global environmental challenges." Her words provided a moment of validation in what had otherwise been a deflating experience. Marcus thanked her and shook hands with each committee member, noting the varying degrees of engagement and warmth in their farewells. As he walked back through the campus, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions. He had presented his best work to one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the country, but the reception had been cooler than anything he had experienced in previous academic settings. Something about the entire process felt predetermined, as if his presentation had been a formality rather than a genuine evaluation of his potential. The other candidates he had observed seemed to inhabit a world where their belonging was assumed, where their merit was presumed, where their place at the table was never questioned. Marcus began to wonder if his achievements, no matter how extraordinary, would ever be enough to overcome perceptions and biases that existed beneath the surface of polite academic discourse. But Marcus Thompson had learned resilience from his grandmother, who had survived decades of systemic challenges while maintaining her dignity and determination. He had learned perseverance from his community, which continued to thrive despite economic abandonment and social neglect. And he had learned that brilliance, innovation, and character were their own forms of power, regardless of whether they were immediately recognized or valued. As Marcus walked toward the campus gates, he had no way of knowing that his 15-minute interview had set in motion a series of events that would expose deep-seated inequities in American higher education and ultimately transform the landscape of academic opportunity for students like him. The real story was just beginning. To understand the magnitude of what happened in that interview room, you need to know who Marcus Thompson really is. Not just the 17-year-old who walked onto Whitmore's campus that morning, but the young man whose journey from Detroit's East Side to national recognition represents everything extraordinary about human potential when it refuses to be limited by circumstance. Marcus's story begins in a small brick house on Gratiot Avenue, where his grandmother Ruby Thompson raised him with the kind of love that transforms obstacles into opportunities. Ruby had worked double shifts at Detroit Receiving Hospital for 37 years, her hands healing others while her heart poured everything into the grandson who had become her world after tragedy struck their family. The car accident that claimed Marcus's parents when he was 12 could have been the end of his story. Instead, it became the beginning of something remarkable. David Thompson had been an automotive engineer at Ford, one of the few black engineers in his department, who spent evenings teaching Marcus about mechanical systems and problem-solving. Sarah Thompson was a high school chemistry teacher who turned their kitchen into a laboratory where curiosity was the only required ingredient. When they died, Marcus didn't just lose his parents. He lost his first teachers, his champions, his guides into a world of scientific wonder. But Ruby Thompson, despite having only a high school education herself, understood that her grandson carried something special. She saw it in the way he took apart every broken appliance in their house, not to destroy but to understand. She saw it in how he stayed up late, reading library books about physics and chemistry. Flashlight under the covers when the electricity was shut off. By age 13, Marcus had converted the basement of their small house into what he called his innovation lab. Using salvaged materials from junkyards and donations from local businesses, he created a workspace where discarded electronics found new life and impossible ideas became tangible prototypes. The neighbors initially thought the constant sounds of drilling, welding, and machinery were just a teenager making noise. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of innovations that would eventually capture national attention. The water filtration breakthrough that first brought Marcus recognition emerged from pure necessity. The summer he turned 14, the Flint water crisis was dominating headlines, and Marcus watched as families across Michigan struggled with contaminated drinking water. He knew that traditional filtration systems were expensive and often ineffective against the specific types of industrial contamination affecting urban communities. Working 16-hour days in his basement lab, Marcus developed a multi-stage filtration system using locally sourced materials that could remove lead, bacteria, and chemical contaminants at a fraction of the cost of existing technologies. The breakthrough came when he realized that certain types of recycled plastics, when treated with specific chemical processes, could serve as highly effective filtration media. His first prototype was built entirely from materials found in Detroit's abandoned buildings and recycling centers. The housing was constructed from repurposed automotive parts, a nod to his father's legacy and his city's industrial heritage. The filtration chambers used modified components from old refrigerators and air conditioning units. Even the monitoring system was assembled from discarded computer parts and smartphone components. When Marcus submitted his design to the state environmental engineering competition, the judges initially assumed there had been some mistake. A 14-year-old from Detroit, working with salvage materials in a basement laboratory, couldn't possibly have developed technology that outperformed systems created by major corporations with million-dollar research budgets. But the testing results were undeniable. Marcus's filtration system didn't just work, it exceeded every performance benchmark. It removed 99.7% of lead contamination, eliminated dangerous bacteria strains, and reduced chemical pollutants to levels well below federal safety standards. Perhaps most impressively, it did all of this at a manufacturing cost that was 80% lower than existing alternatives. The recognition that followed changed Marcus's life trajectory forever. The Environmental Protection Agency invited him to present his work at their National Youth Innovation Summit. The presentation, delivered to an audience of environmental scientists, policymakers, and industry leaders, established Marcus as one of the most promising young inventors in the country. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a senior research scientist at the EPA, later described that presentation as one of the most impressive technical demonstrations she had witnessed from any researcher, regardless of age. Marcus didn't just solve a problem, she recalled. He understood the intersection of environmental science, economic accessibility, and social justice in ways that many of our most experienced professionals struggle with. The success of the water filtration system opened doors Marcus had never imagined possible. Patent applications were filed, with Marcus listed as the primary inventor. Major environmental organizations reached out to discuss potential collaborations. University professors invited him to participate in research projects typically reserved for graduate students. But Marcus's innovations didn't stop with water filtration. Driven by the problems he saw in his own community, he continued developing solutions that addressed real-world challenges faced by urban populations. His second major breakthrough was an air purification system designed specifically for homes near industrial facilities, where respiratory illness rates were significantly higher than national averages. This project required Marcus to dive deep into atmospheric chemistry, learning about particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, and the complex interactions between different types of air pollution. He spent months studying air quality data from monitoring stations across Detroit, identifying patterns and concentrations that existing purification systems weren't designed to address. The resulting invention was a modular air cleaning system that could be installed in existing heating and cooling systems without major renovations. Like his water filtration work, it used innovative applications of common materials to achieve superior results at dramatically reduced costs. The system was particularly effective at removing the fine particulate matter and chemical pollutants associated with automotive manufacturing and steel production, making it perfectly suited for industrial cities like Detroit. By age 16, Marcus held patents on 7 different environmental technologies. His innovations had caught the attention of major universities, technology companies, and research institutions across the country. He had been invited to speak at conferences from MIT to Stanford, sharing stages with Nobel Prize winners and industry pioneers. But perhaps Marcus's most remarkable quality wasn't his technical brilliance. It was his unwavering commitment to using his abilities to serve others. Every innovation he developed was specifically designed to address problems affecting underserved communities. He could have focused on commercially lucrative technologies that would appeal to wealthy consumers, but Marcus consistently chose to tackle challenges that impacted people like his neighbors, his classmates, his grandmother. This commitment to social impact was most evident in Marcus's third major project, a sustainable urban farming system that could produce fresh vegetables in areas classified as food deserts. Growing up, Marcus had watched his grandmother struggle to find affordable fresh produce in their neighborhood, where the closest full-service grocery store was more than 3 miles away and accessible only by unreliable public transportation. The urban farming system Marcus developed used vertical growing techniques, automated nutrient delivery, and solar power collection to create productive agricultural spaces in abandoned lots and unused buildings. The technology was sophisticated enough to optimize growing conditions for maximum yield, but simple enough to be operated by community volunteers without extensive training. The first installation of Marcus's urban farming system was in the vacant lot next to his grandmother's house, Within 6 months, it was producing enough fresh vegetables to supply 12 families in their neighborhood. The success of this pilot project attracted attention from urban planning organizations and municipal governments across the Midwest. Marcus's academic performance matched his innovation achievements. Despite attending a chronically underfunded public school where science equipment was outdated and advanced placement courses were limited, he maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA while taking every challenging course available. He supplemented his formal education with online courses from leading universities, often completing college-level work in mathematics, physics, and chemistry during evenings and weekends. His high school counselor, Mrs. Patricia Williams, later described Marcus as the most intellectually curious student she had encountered in 23 years of education. Marcus never asked, "What do I need to know for the test?" she recalled. He always asked, "How can I use this knowledge to solve problems that matter?" That distinction made all the difference. The combination of academic excellence and practical innovation made Marcus an attractive candidate for numerous prestigious scholarship programs. The Pemberton Foundation Scholarship represented the pinnacle of these opportunities. A chance to attend one of the most elite universities in the country while having the resources and support to continue his groundbreaking research. Marcus spent months preparing his application for the Pemberton Scholarship. He crafted essays that articulated his vision for using advanced engineering to address environmental justice issues. He assembled a portfolio documenting his innovations, complete with patent documentation, performance testing results, and letters of support from respected scientists and community leaders. The preparation process revealed Marcus's remarkable maturity and strategic thinking. He understood that the scholarship committee would be evaluating not just his past achievements, but his potential for future impact. His application materials demonstrated a clear trajectory from his current work on localized environmental solutions toward larger-scale research that could influence national and international policy. Dr. James Mitchell, a professor of environmental engineering at the University of Michigan who had mentored Marcus through several research projects, wrote in his recommendation letter, "In 30 years of academic research, I have rarely encountered a young person with Marcus's combination of technical brilliance, practical wisdom, and social consciousness. He represents the next generation of innovators who will tackle the greatest challenges facing our society." Community leaders in Detroit were equally supportive of Marcus's scholarship application. Reverend David Johnson, who had watched Marcus grow up in their neighborhood, emphasized the young man's character and commitment to others. "Marcus could have moved away from Detroit years ago," Reverend Johnson wrote. "Instead, he has chosen to remain rooted in his community, using his extraordinary abilities to lift up everyone around him." Quote, "The letters of recommendation painted a picture of a young man who had transcended every limitation placed in his path while maintaining deep connections to his origins and values. They described someone who understood that true leadership meant empowering others, that real innovation required empathy as much as intelligence." As Marcus prepared for his Whitmore interview, he felt confident that his combination of achievements, character, and vision aligned perfectly with the Pemberton Foundation's stated mission of supporting students who would use their education to create positive change in the world. He had researched the previous scholarship recipients, studying their backgrounds and career trajectories, and felt certain that his profile matched what the foundation claimed to value. Ruby Thompson watched her grandson prepare for the interview with pride that ran deeper than words could express. She had sacrificed everything to provide Marcus with opportunities, working extra shifts to pay for materials for his projects, taking on debt to ensure he could attend academic conferences and competitions. She had never doubted that her investment would pay dividends, not just for Marcus, but for everyone whose lives would be touched by his innovations. On the morning of the Whitmore interview, Ruby stood in the doorway of their small house and watched Marcus walk toward the bus that would take him to the airport. She had raised a young man who carried the hopes of his community, the legacy of his parents, and the potential to change the world. She had no way of knowing that the interview he was about to face would test not just his qualifications, but the fundamental fairness of the institutions that claimed to champion merit and opportunity. Marcus Thompson arrived at Whitmore University that morning carrying more than just his portfolio and presentations. He carried the dreams of a grandmother who had given everything for his success, the memory of parents who had instilled in him a love of learning, the support of a community that had believed in his potential, and the weight of responsibility that comes with extraordinary gifts. He also carried something else, an unshakable belief that excellence speaks for itself. that innovation creates its own opportunities, and that institutions dedicated to education would recognize and nurture talent regardless of its origins. That belief was about to be tested in ways Marcus had never imagined possible. The young man who walked through Whitmore's gates that morning had already proven that brilliance could emerge from anywhere, that creativity could flourish under any circumstances, and that determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. What he was about to discover was that some barriers are maintained not by limitation of opportunity, but by limitation of vision, and that sometimes the most important innovations happen not in laboratories, but in moments when courage confronts complacency. What happened next in that Whitmore conference room would expose the invisible machinery of institutional bias that operates behind closed doors, where decisions about young people's futures are made not on merit, but on assumptions that have nothing to do with ability or potential. As Marcus left the interview room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had gone wrong. The coldness he'd experienced wasn't just professional distance. It was something deeper, more troubling. He had participated in dozens of academic presentations, research conferences, and evaluation sessions throughout his high school career. And never had he encountered such obvious disinterest from supposedly engaged educators. Walking across the Whitmore campus toward the parking structure where his rental car waited, Marcus replayed every moment of the interview in his mind. The delayed start time, the lack of engagement from committee members, the dismissive questions about his family background and financial situation, the contrast between his reception and what he had observed with the other candidates in the waiting room. Marcus reached his car and sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Dr. Elena Rodriguez's number. Dr. Rodriguez had been his mentor since the EPA Innovation Summit, and her guidance had been instrumental in Marcus's decision to apply for the Pemberton Scholarship. Marcus. Dr. Rodriguez's voice was warm and enthusiastic when she answered. How did the Whitmore interview go? I've been thinking about you all morning. Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It was different from what I expected. The committee seemed distracted, and I'm not sure they were really interested in my research. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Dr. Rodriguez had worked in academic and government settings long enough to recognize the coded language that often surrounded discussions of bias and discrimination. Tell me more about what happened, she said gently. As Marcus described the interview experience, the delayed start, the lack of engagement, the perfunctory questions, Dr. Rodriguez felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had witnessed similar scenarios throughout her career, moments when brilliant young people encountered walls that had nothing to do with their qualifications or potential. Marcus, Dr. Rodriguez said carefully, I want you to know that whatever happened in that room reflects on them, not on you. Your work speaks for itself, and any institution that fails to recognize your potential is making a serious mistake. After ending the call with Dr. Rodriguez, Marcus drove toward Boston Logan Airport, where he would catch his flight back to Detroit. The 2-hour drive gave him time to process what had occurred and consider his next steps. The Pemberton Scholarship had been his preferred path to higher education. But it wasn't his only option. Several other universities had expressed interest in his work, and there were alternative scholarship programs that might provide similar opportunities. Meanwhile, back in Harrison Hall, the Pemberton Foundation Selection Committee was concluding their day of interviews. The 5 committee members gathered in Dr. Blackwood's office to discuss the candidates they had met and begin the process of selecting the scholarship recipients. Well, Dr. Blackwood said, settling into his leather chair behind an imposing mahogany desk, we certainly had some impressive candidates today. Let's start with Stephanie Morrison. The discussion that followed revealed much about the unspoken criteria that actually governed the selection process. Stephanie's academic credentials were strong, but not exceptional. Her research experience was limited to a single summer internship at her father's investment firm. Her community service consisted primarily of organizing charity galas for causes popular among wealthy donors. Stephanie has excellent breeding, Professor Hartwell observed. Her family has been connected to Whitmore for 3 generations. Her grandfather was on our board of trustees. She'll fit seamlessly into our community, Ms. Prescott added. I worked with her mother on the hospital fundraising campaign last year. Lovely family, very generous to the university. Dr. Pemberton III nodded approvingly. The The Morrison family has been supporting educational initiatives for decades. Stephanie represents the kind of continuity we value in our scholarship recipients. The conversation continued in similar fashion as they discussed each candidate. James Hartford's qualifications were evaluated alongside detailed knowledge of his family's real estate empire and political connections. Alexandra Chen's academic achievements were mentioned, but equal time was devoted to her parents' membership in exclusive country clubs and their potential for future donations to the university. When they reached Marcus Thompson's application, the tone of the discussion shifted noticeably. "The Thompson boy," Dr. Blackwood said, glancing at Marcus's file without opening it. "Certainly bright, but I have concerns about cultural fit." Professor Hartwell frowned. His technical work is undeniably impressive. Those patents and publications would normally put him at the top of our candidate pool. "Academic achievement isn't everything," Ms. Prescott interjected. "We need to consider whether our scholarship recipients will thrive in Whitmore's environment and contribute to our alumni network after graduation." Dr. Pemberton III leaned back in his chair. "I'm not sure students from that background understand the responsibilities that come with a Pemberton scholarship. This isn't just financial aid. It's membership in a community that has very specific expectations and traditions." The euphemisms and coded language filled the room like toxic smoke. No one explicitly mentioned Marcus's race, his economic background, or his geographic origins, but everyone understood the subtext. The cultural fit concerns weren't about Marcus's personality or social skills. They were about whether a young black man from Detroit belonged in an institution that had been designed by and for wealthy white families. Dr. Richards, who had been quiet during most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "I have to say I'm troubled by this conversation. Marcus Thompson's achievements are extraordinary by any objective measure. His research has practical applications that could benefit millions of people. Isn't that exactly what the Pemberton Foundation is supposed to support?" The room fell silent. Dr. Richards had violated an unspoken rule by directly challenging the committee's implicit bias. Her colleagues exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to respond to such direct confrontation. Dr. Blackwood cleared his throat. "Amanda, no one is questioning the young man's intelligence. But we have to consider the complete picture. The Pemberton Scholarship creates lifetime relationships and professional networks. Our recipients become ambassadors for Whitmore University and the Foundation. We need people who understand how to navigate elite professional environments." "Are you suggesting that Marcus doesn't have the social skills to succeed in professional settings?" Dr. Richards asked pointedly. "Because I watched him present his research to some of the most distinguished scientists in the country, and he was remarkably poised and articulate." Professor Hartwell shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about social skills exactly. It's about compatibility. Our scholarship recipients attend events with major donors, participate in exclusive academic conferences, represent the university at high-level functions. There are certain cultural competencies required for those roles." Dr. Richards felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. She understood exactly what her colleagues were saying, and she recognized her own complicity in a system that routinely excluded talented students who didn't match predetermined demographic profiles. "What you're describing," Dr. Richards said slowly, "sounds like discrimination based on socioeconomic background and, frankly, race. Marcus Thompson has already demonstrated his ability to excel in elite academic settings. His research has been published in peer-reviewed journals. He's presented at national conferences. Major universities are recruiting him. By what measure is he less qualified than our other candidates?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Ms. Prescott was the first to respond, her voice defensive. "This isn't about discrimination. It's about institutional fit and long-term success. We've found that students from certain backgrounds sometimes struggle with the social demands of our program." "Based on what evidence?" Dr. Richards pressed. "Have we actually tracked the success rates of scholarship recipients by demographic background? Do we have data supporting these assumptions? Or are we making decisions based on stereotypes and unconscious bias?" Dr. Pemberton III's jaw tightened. "I resent the implication that this committee makes decisions based on prejudice. We're all committed to diversity and inclusion. But we also have a responsibility to maintain the standards and traditions that have made this scholarship program prestigious." The circular logic was maddening. The standards and traditions that Dr. Pemberton III referenced were the same systems that had historically excluded students like Marcus. Maintaining those traditions meant perpetuating exclusion, regardless of merit or potential. Dr. Richards realized she was fighting not just against individual bias, but against institutional inertia that had operated unchallenged for decades. The other committee members weren't necessarily malicious. They were products of a system that had taught them to conflate privilege with merit, to mistake familiarity for competence. "I'd like to propose," Dr. Richards said carefully, "that we evaluate all candidates using the same objective criteria: academic achievement, research experience, innovation potential, and demonstrated leadership. If we apply those standards consistently, Marcus Thompson ranks among the top candidates we've interviewed." Dr. Blackwood's expression hardened. "Amanda, I appreciate your advocacy, but selection committees require consensus. We can't move forward with candidates who don't have broad support from the group." The message was clear. Dr. Richards could continue her objections, but she would be outvoted 4-1. The scholarship decisions had been made before the interviews even began, based on social connections and cultural assumptions that had nothing to do with the Foundation's stated mission. As the meeting concluded, the committee had effectively decided to award the 5 Pemberton scholarships to students whose primary qualifications were family wealth, social connections, and cultural similarity to previous recipients. Marcus Thompson's groundbreaking research, exceptional academic record, and transformative potential were deemed insufficient to overcome his failure to meet unstated requirements about background and social class. Dr. Richards left the meeting feeling complicit in an injustice that violated everything she believed about education and opportunity. She had entered academia, believing that universities were meritocratic institutions where talent and hard work were rewarded regardless of origin. The afternoon's discussion had shattered those illusions and forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems she had spent her career serving. That evening, Dr. Richards sat in her faculty office long after her colleagues had gone home, staring at Marcus Thompson's application materials spread across her desk. His research papers documented innovations that could revolutionize environmental protection and public health. His letters of recommendation described a young man of exceptional character and commitment to social justice. His academic transcripts showed perfect performance, despite attending a chronically underfunded school. By any reasonable measure, Marcus Thompson was exactly the kind of student the Pemberton Foundation should be supporting. His potential for positive impact was enormous, his dedication to serving others was proven, and his intellectual abilities were extraordinary. The committee's rejection of his candidacy represented institutional failure of the highest order. Dr. Richards picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Marcus's number. She had no authority to overturn the committee's decision, but she felt obligated to provide some explanation for what had occurred. The conversation would be difficult and painful, but Marcus deserved honesty about the forces that had worked against him. When Marcus answered, Dr. Richards could hear airport announcements in the background. He was already preparing to return to Detroit, probably assuming that the scholarship process would continue normally, and that he would receive notification of the committee's decision within the standard time frame. "Marcus," Dr. Richards said, her voice heavy with regret, "I wanted to call and discuss your interview today. I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share." As Dr. Richards explained what had transpired in the committee meeting, Marcus felt something inside him crystallize. The disappointment was sharp, but not surprising. Part of him had sensed during the interview that the outcome had been predetermined. What struck him most was Dr. Richards' courage in making this call, her willingness to expose institutional bias at potential cost to her own career. "Dr. Richards," Marcus said quietly, "I appreciate your honesty more than you know. What happens now?" "I don't know," Dr. Richards replied. "But I want you to understand that this decision reflects institutional failure, not any shortcoming on your part. Your work is extraordinary, and any university would be fortunate to have you." Quote, after ending the call, Marcus sat in the airport terminal, processing what he had learned. The rejection stung, but it also clarified something important about the systems he was trying to enter. Excellence wasn't enough if you didn't match demographic expectations. Merit was filtered through cultural biases that operated beneath the surface of official policies. Marcus thought about his grandmother, who had faced similar barriers throughout her nursing career but had persevered with dignity and determination. He thought about his parents, who had navigated professional environments where their competence was constantly questioned and their contributions undervalued. He thought about his community in Detroit, where brilliant minds were often overlooked, because they didn't emerge from expected places. The Pemberton scholarship rejection was disappointing, but it wasn't devastating. Marcus had other options, other paths to pursue his education and research. What troubled him more was the realization that the same biases that had affected his candidacy were probably impacting other students across the country, young people who might not have his resources, mentorship, or resilience. As Marcus boarded his flight back to Detroit, he had no way of knowing that Dr. Richards' phone call had been overheard by a janitor working late in Harrison Hall, a man whose own son had faced similar discrimination in college admissions. He had no way of knowing that word of the committee's biased deliberations would reach other faculty members who shared Dr. Richards' concerns about institutional fairness. Most importantly, Marcus had no way of knowing that his father, David Thompson Sr., was very much alive and had spent the years since the supposed car accident building one of the most successful technology companies in the world while allowing his son to grow up believing he was an orphan, for reasons that would soon become clear. The rejection that felt like an ending was actually the beginning of something much larger, a confrontation with systemic bias that would expose uncomfortable truths about American higher education and ultimately transform opportunities for students from underrepresented backgrounds across the country. But first, Marcus Thompson had to get home to Detroit, where a conversation with his grandmother would reveal family secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about his past, his present, and his power to shape the future. The flight from Boston to Detroit gave Marcus 3 hours to process what had happened and consider his next moves. As the plane descended through the clouds toward Detroit Metropolitan Airport, Marcus stared out the window at the city lights below, thinking about the conversation he needed to have with his grandmother and the decisions that lay ahead. What Marcus didn't know was that his story was already beginning to ripple outward in ways that would soon amplify far beyond his imagination. Back at Whitmore University, Dr. Amanda Richards sat in her office until nearly midnight, unable to concentrate on grading papers or preparing lectures. The afternoon's committee meeting had left her feeling complicit in an injustice that violated everything she believed about academic integrity and equal opportunity. She had entered higher education because she believed universities could be forces for social mobility and positive change. But the Pemberton Foundation's selection process had revealed how those institutions could perpetuate the very inequalities they claimed to address. Richards opened her laptop and began typing an email to Dr. Sarah Chin, the chair of Whitmore's Faculty Senate and one of the few people in the university administration who had consistently advocated for genuine diversity and inclusion initiatives. The email was carefully worded but clear about what had transpired during the scholarship selection process. Sarah, Dr. Richards wrote, I need to discuss a serious concern about the Pemberton Foundation selection process. We may have institutional bias issues that require immediate attention. Can we meet tomorrow morning? At the same time, across campus in the janitorial services break room, Carlos Rivera was finishing his shift and thinking about what he had overheard in Harrison Hall. Carlos had worked at Whitmore for 15 years, cleaning offices and conference rooms while remaining largely invisible to the faculty and administrators whose conversations he couldn't help but hear. His own son, Miguel, was a senior in high school with outstanding grades and dreams of attending a prestigious university, dreams that Carlos feared might be crushed by the same kinds of barriers he had witnessed being erected around Marcus Thompson. Carlos pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number from Maria Santos, a reporter at the Boston Herald who had written several investigative pieces about educational inequality in Massachusetts. Maria had grown up in Carlos's neighborhood and had often spoken about the importance of exposing systemic barriers that prevented talented students from accessing opportunities. Maria, Carlos said when she answered, It's Carlos Rivera. I have something you need to know about what's happening at Whitmore University. Meanwhile, Marcus's plane touched down in Detroit, and he made his way through the familiar corridors of the airport toward the baggage claim where his grandmother Ruby was waiting. Ruby Thompson had raised Marcus for 5 years with unwavering love and support, but she had also been carrying a secret that weighed heavier on her conscience with each passing day. As Marcus approached, Ruby could see something different in his demeanor. The confidence and excitement he had carried when leaving for Boston had been replaced by a thoughtful sadness that she recognized from her own experiences with institutional discrimination decades earlier. "How did it go, baby?" Ruby asked, embracing her grandson warmly. Marcus hesitated, not wanting to worry his grandmother, but also needing to share what had happened. "It wasn't what I expected, Grandma. I think they had already made their decisions before the interviews even started." During the drive home through Detroit's familiar streets, Marcus described the interview experience while Ruby listened with growing anger and recognition. She had faced similar treatment throughout her nursing career, moments when her qualifications were questioned and her potential dismissed based on assumptions that had nothing to do with her abilities. "Marcus," Ruby said as they pulled into their driveway, "there's something we need to talk about. Something I should have told you years ago." Inside their small house, Ruby led Marcus to the living room where she had displayed photos of his parents throughout his childhood. But now she walked to a drawer that Marcus had never seen her open and pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it had been handled many times over the years. "Your father didn't die in that car accident," Ruby said quietly, her voice heavy with years of carried secrets. "David Thompson is alive, and he's been watching over you from a distance for years." Quote. Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his history, his circumstances, was suddenly called into question. "What are you talking about, Grandma?" "I remember the funeral. I remember the car accident." Ruby opened the envelope and pulled out photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings that told a completely different story. David Thompson Sr. was not a deceased automotive engineer from Detroit. He was the founder and CEO of Quantum Dynamics Corporation, a technology company based in Silicon Valley that had become one of the most valuable firms in the world. "Your father left when you were 12 because he was facing death threats," Ruby explained, her voice breaking with emotion. "There were people who wanted to destroy him, to hurt his family. The only way he could protect you and your mother was to disappear, to let everyone believe he was dead." The documents revealed that Sarah Thompson, Marcus's mother, had indeed died in a car accident, but it hadn't been random. She had been targeted because of David's business activities, his efforts to expose corruption in the defense contracting industry, where Quantum Dynamics had major government contracts. "Your father has been supporting us financially all these years," Ruby continued. "The house, your education, your research materials. None of it came from my nursing salary. David has been ensuring you had everything you needed while staying hidden to keep you safe." Marcus stared at the photographs of his father. Not the automotive engineer he remembered, but a powerful businessman whose company had revolutionized cybersecurity technology and whose innovations were protecting critical infrastructure around the world. "Why are you telling me this now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because," Ruby said, "it's time for you to know who you really are. And because what happened to you today at that university is exactly the kind of injustice your father has spent his career fighting against." As Marcus absorbed this life-changing revelation, Ruby handed him a secure phone that had been hidden in the drawer for years. "Your father has been waiting for you to be ready for this conversation. He's been watching your achievements, supporting your research, and preparing for the day when you would need to know the truth." With trembling hands, Marcus dialed the number Ruby had written on a piece of paper. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, a voice that Marcus recognized from childhood memories that suddenly felt like dreams from another lifetime. "Hello, son," David Thompson Sr. said. "I've been waiting 17 years for this call." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, as father and son reconnected across years of separation and deception that had been necessary for survival but painful beyond measure. David explained how he had built Quantum Dynamics from nothing, how the company's success had made him enemies in powerful places, and how the threats against his family had forced him to make the impossible choice between his presence and their safety. "I've followed every one of your innovations," David told Marcus. "Your water filtration system, your air purification technology, your urban farming projects. You've accomplished more at 17 than most researchers achieve in their entire careers." "But you weren't there," Marcus replied, years of suppressed pain evident in his voice. "I thought you were dead. I grew up believing I was alone." "You were never alone," David said firmly. "I was always watching, always supporting, always proud. And now that you're older, now that the immediate threats have been neutralized, we can be a family again." As the conversation continued, David learned about Marcus's experience at Whitmore University and the biased scholarship selection process that had rejected his candidacy despite his extraordinary qualifications. "Dad," Marcus said, using the word that felt both foreign and natural, "I don't need their scholarship. I have other options. But there are other students who don't. students who will face the same discrimination without any recourse. David was quiet for a long moment. Marcus, there's something else you need to know. Quantum Dynamics has been the largest single donor to Whitmore University for the past 8 years. We've contributed over $50 million to their endowment, funded their new engineering building, and sponsored their graduate research programs. The implications hit Marcus immediately. His father's company was essentially subsidizing the institution that had just discriminated against him based on assumptions about his background and qualifications. "What are you going to do about it?" Marcus asked. "That depends," David replied. "What do you want to see happen?" The question carried enormous weight. David Thompson Sr. had the financial power to significantly impact Whitmore University's operations and reputation. A withdrawal of support from Quantum Dynamics would send shockwaves through the institution and force administrators to confront their biased practices. But Marcus had learned from his grandmother's example that true change required more than punitive measures. It required building systems that prevented discrimination rather than simply punishing it after the fact. "I want them to face the truth about what they're doing," Marcus said. "I want other students to have genuine opportunities based on merit rather than connections. And I want the people who perpetuate these systems to understand the real cost of their biases." Meanwhile, across the country, the story was beginning to gain momentum through channels that the Whitmore administration couldn't control or suppress. Dr. Sarah Chen had met with Dr. Richards early that morning and had been horrified by the details of the Pemberton Foundation selection process. As Faculty Senate Chair, Dr. Chen had authority to launch formal investigations into potential discrimination by university-affiliated organizations. Maria Santos, the Boston Herald reporter, had spent the night researching Whitmore University's diversity statistics, donor relationships, and previous controversies related to admissions and scholarship processes. Her conversation with Carlos Rivera had provided specific details about the committee's biased deliberations, and she was preparing to contact Marcus Thompson directly for his perspective on what had occurred. Dr. Elena Rodriguez at the EPA had also been busy, reaching out to her network of contacts in academia, government, and industry to share her concerns about Marcus's treatment at Whitmore. As a respected scientist with decades of experience in environmental policy, Dr. Rodriguez's opinions carried significant weight in professional circles. By noon on the day after Marcus's interview, the story was developing momentum across multiple fronts. Academic leaders were questioning Whitmore's commitment to diversity and inclusion. Journalists were investigating patterns of discrimination in elite scholarship programs. Government officials who had worked with Marcus on environmental projects were expressing concern about barriers facing talented young researchers. But the most significant development occurred in the boardroom of Quantum Dynamics Corporation, where David Thompson Sr. was meeting with his executive team to discuss the company's relationship with Whitmore University and the broader implications of institutional bias in higher education. "We've been funding an institution that just discriminated against my son," David told his senior staff. "This isn't just a personal issue. It's a systemic problem that affects thousands of talented students who don't have the resources or connections to fight back." The room was silent as David outlined what had transpired during Marcus's interview and the biased selection process that had followed. Several of the executives were alumni of elite universities themselves, and they recognized the cultural dynamics that Marcus had encountered. "What do you want to do?" asked Jennifer Walsh, Quantum Dynamics Chief Operating Officer. David turned to look out the window at the Silicon Valley landscape where so many technological innovations had emerged from garages and basements, often created by people who had been overlooked or dismissed by traditional institutions. "I want to create consequences that matter," David said, "not just for Whitmore, but for every institution that perpetuates these barriers. It's time to show them what happens when they reject talent based on bias rather than merit." As David spoke, Marcus was in Detroit having similar conversations with community leaders, educators, and fellow young innovators who had faced their own encounters with institutional discrimination. The story was becoming larger than one rejected scholarship application. It was becoming a catalyst for examining systemic barriers that prevented talented students from accessing opportunities they had earned. Richards received a call that afternoon from Dr. Chen, informing her that the Faculty Senate would be launching a formal investigation into the Pemberton Foundation selection process. Several other faculty members had come forward with concerns about bias in various university programs, and the institution was facing the possibility of a comprehensive review of its diversity and inclusion practices. "Amanda, Dr. Chen said, "I want you to know that your courage in speaking up is going to create positive change. This investigation will ensure that what happened to Marcus Thompson doesn't happen to other deserving students." Quote, as the sun set over Detroit, Marcus sat with his grandmother on their front porch, watching neighborhood children play in the street and thinking about how much his world had changed in 24 hours. He had learned that his father was alive, that his family had resources he had never imagined, and that his rejection from Whitmore was part of a larger pattern of institutional bias that affected countless other students. But Marcus had also discovered something else, that he wasn't alone in fighting for change. Allies were emerging from unexpected places, people who were willing to risk their own comfort and security to challenge systems that perpetuated inequality. The phone calls, emails, and meetings happening across the country were building towards something unprecedented, a confrontation with institutional bias that would force American higher education to examine its most cherished assumptions about merit, opportunity, and who deserves a seat at the table of elite education. The rejection that had felt like a personal defeat was transforming into a movement for systemic change, powered by the combined efforts of a brilliant young inventor, his powerful father, courageous educators, investigative journalists, and community advocates who refused to accept that bias should determine opportunity. The real battle was just beginning. The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything. David Thompson Sr. stood in his corner office overlooking Silicon Valley, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, while speaking to his legal team about the most important decision of his business career. "Are you absolutely certain about this, David?" asked Robert Chen, Quantum Dynamics' chief legal counsel and David's trusted advisor for over a decade. "Withdrawing $50 million in committed funding will have massive implications, not just for Whitmore, but for every educational institution we work with." David held a printed copy of Maria Santos's newspaper article, which had been published that morning, with the headline "Elite University Scholarship Program Accused of Racial Bias." The article detailed Marcus's experience and included quotes from Dr. Amanda Richards, who had courageously gone on record about the discriminatory selection process she had witnessed. "Robert," David said quietly, "my son developed technology that could revolutionize environmental protection and public health. He's published research in peer-reviewed journals and holds more patents at 17 than most scientists accumulate in their entire careers, and they rejected him because he doesn't fit their social profile." The article had gone viral overnight, shared across social media platforms, and picked up by major news networks. #Scholarshipias was trending on Twitter, with thousands of students sharing their own experiences of discrimination in college admissions and scholarship programs. But what made this story different was the involvement of Quantum Dynamics Corporation. Maria Santos had done her research and discovered the connection between Marcus Thompson and David Thompson Sr., along with the massive financial relationship between Quantum Dynamics and Whitmore University. At Whitmore, President Victoria Harrison was in crisis management mode. Her phone had been ringing since 6 a.m., with calls from board members, major donors, alumni leaders, and media outlets seeking comment on the explosive allegations. The university's public relations team was scrambling to craft a response that would minimize damage to the institution's reputation. "How did this get so far out of control?" President Harrison asked during an emergency meeting with her senior staff. "We're talking about one scholarship application that was handled through normal processes." Dean of Admissions Richard Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The article had quoted him directly from the selection committee meeting, thanks to information provided by someone who had clearly been present during their deliberations. "There may have been some miscommunication about the selection criteria," Dr. Blackwood said carefully, "but our process has always been thorough and fair." "Fair?" Dr. Sarah Chen interrupted, having been invited to the meeting as faculty senate chair. "I've reviewed the notes from that selection committee, and the conversation was blatantly discriminatory. You rejected the most qualified candidate because you questioned his cultural fit, language that everyone understands as code for racial and socioeconomic bias." The room fell silent. Dr. Chen continued, "We're facing a faculty senate investigation, a potential civil rights complaint, and now the withdrawal of our largest corporate donor. This isn't a public relations problem. It's an institutional crisis that requires real accountability." Quote, Meanwhile, Marcus was experiencing his first taste of national media attention. His phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests from CNN, NBC, The Washington Post, and dozens of other outlets. The shy teenager who had walked onto Whitmore's campus just days earlier was now at the center of a national conversation about discrimination in higher education. "I never wanted this to become a media circus," Marcus told his father during one of their frequent phone conversations. "I just wanted a fair chance to prove myself." "Sometimes," David replied, "the most important changes happen when private injustices become public conversations. Your story is resonating because it represents something larger: the barriers that talented young people face when they don't match traditional expectations." Dr. Elena Rodriguez had also been busy, coordinating with other scientists and government officials who had worked with Marcus to provide public support for his character and achievements. A letter signed by 47 environmental researchers, including 3 Nobel Prize winners, was delivered to Whitmore's president that morning. The letter read, "Marcus Thompson represents the future of environmental science and innovation. Any institution that fails to recognize his extraordinary potential is demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of merit and academic excellence. We call upon Whitmore University to review its selection processes and ensure that bias does not prevent talented students from accessing educational opportunities." But the most dramatic moment came at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when David Thompson Sr. held a press conference at Quantum Dynamics headquarters. The event was live-streamed across multiple platforms and attended by reporters from major news organizations around the world. David stood at a podium flanked by American flags and the Quantum Dynamics corporate logo, his expression serious but composed. Behind him, a large screen displayed some of Marcus's patents and research publications, providing visual evidence of the young man's exceptional achievements. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, "I'm here today to discuss a decision that affects not just my company, but the future of educational opportunity in America." Quote. The audience of reporters and cameras captured every word as David outlined the story of Marcus's discrimination at Whitmore University and the biased selection process that had rejected his candidacy for the Pemberton Foundation Scholarship. "My son Marcus Thompson is a brilliant innovator whose work has the potential to address some of the most pressing environmental challenges facing our world," David continued. "He has been recognized by the Environmental Protection Agency, published in scientific journals, and earned 17 patents before his 18th birthday. Yet, Whitmore University Scholarship Committee decided he wasn't a, quote, fit for their program." David paused, allowing the implications to settle. "As CEO of Quantum Dynamics Corporation, I have supported higher education throughout my career because I believe universities should be engines of opportunity and innovation. We have donated over $50 million to Whitmore University over the past 8 years, funding research programs, scholarships, and infrastructure development." The camera operator zoomed in as David's expression hardened. "Today, I am announcing that Quantum Dynamics is immediately withdrawing all financial support from Whitmore University. We are terminating our research partnerships, ending our scholarship programs, and canceling our planned contributions to their capital campaign." The room erupted with questions from reporters, but David continued speaking. "This decision affects approximately $50 million in committed funding, including $25 million that was designated for a new engineering research facility that will now be built elsewhere." The financial implications were staggering. $50 million represented nearly 10% of Whitmore's total endowment, and the engineering facility had been a centerpiece of the university's strategic development plan. The withdrawal would force massive budget cuts and potentially affect hundreds of faculty positions and student programs. "However," David continued, "this is not just about punishment, it's about creating positive change. Quantum Dynamics is establishing the Marcus Thompson Foundation for Educational Equity, with an initial endowment of $100 million. This foundation will provide scholarships specifically for talented students from underrepresented backgrounds who demonstrate exceptional potential in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics." Quote. The announcement sent shockwaves through the higher education community. David Thompson Sr. wasn't just withdrawing support from one university. He was creating an alternative system that would directly compete with traditional scholarship programs and potentially reshape how merit was evaluated and rewarded. The Marcus Thompson Foundation will partner with universities that demonstrate genuine commitment to diversity and inclusion, David explained. "We will fund research programs, provide mentorship opportunities, and create pathways for talented students regardless of their racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic backgrounds. Back at Whitmore, President Harrison watched the press conference with growing horror. The immediate financial impact would be devastating, but the long-term reputational damage could be even worse. Other major donors were already calling to express concerns about the university's values and practices. "We need to respond immediately," President Harrison told her communications team. "Draft a statement acknowledging our commitment to diversity and inclusion and announce a comprehensive review of our scholarship processes." But Dr. Sarah Chen shook her head. "Victoria, you can't public relations your way out of this. The faculty, students, and alumni are demanding real accountability. Anything less than fundamental change will be seen as damage control rather than genuine reform." The afternoon brought even more developments. The Department of Education announced that it would be investigating Whitmore University's compliance with federal civil rights laws. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office indicated that it was reviewing potential violations of state anti-discrimination statutes. Alumni groups at several other elite universities were demanding reviews of their own scholarship and admissions processes. Perhaps most significantly, students were organizing. Within hours of David Thompson's press conference, student groups at dozens of universities had planned solidarity rallies supporting Marcus and calling for systematic reviews of bias in higher education. The hashtag Marcus Matters was trending globally, with students sharing their own experiences of discrimination and demanding institutional change. Marcus found himself at the center of a movement he had never intended to create. That evening, he received a call from Malcolm Rodriguez, a student leader at Harvard University who was organizing a coalition of student governments to address educational discrimination. "Marcus," Malcolm said, "your story has given voice to something thousands of us have experienced but never had the platform to address. We want to stand with you in demanding change, not just at Whitmore, but across the entire system." Similar calls came throughout the evening from student leaders, young activists, and educational advocates who saw Marcus's experience as a catalyst for broader reform. The teenager who had been rejected from one scholarship program was becoming a symbol of resistance against systemic bias in American higher education. At Whitmore, the pressure was mounting from all directions. Emergency board meetings were called as trustees tried to understand the full scope of the crisis. Faculty members were demanding answers about institutional policies and practices. Students were organizing protests calling for administrative accountability. Dr. Richards, who had initiated much of the change by speaking truthfully about the committee's bias, received support from colleagues across the country, but also faced criticism from some Whitmore administrators who blamed her for the university's current predicament. "Amanda," Dr. Chen told her during a private conversation, "you did the right thing. Institutions only change when people inside them have the courage to speak truth to power." As the day ended, it was clear that the Whitmore University controversy had evolved far beyond a single scholarship rejection. It had become a national reckoning with bias in higher education, forcing institutions across the country to examine their own practices and confront uncomfortable questions about who they serve and why. The financial withdrawal from quantum dynamics would have immediate practical effects, but the broader cultural impact was already reshaping conversations about merit, opportunity, and institutional responsibility. Universities that had operated with implicit biases for decades were suddenly facing public scrutiny and demands for transparency. Marcus Thompson, the 17-year-old innovator who had simply wanted a chance to continue his education and research, had inadvertently sparked a movement that would transform American higher education. His father's dramatic response had amplified a personal injustice into a national conversation about systemic change. But the most important changes were still to come. The Marcus Thompson Foundation represented more than just alternative funding. It represented a different vision of how talent should be identified, nurtured, and rewarded. As universities scrambled to respond to the crisis, they would be forced to confront fundamental questions about their values, their practices, and their commitment to genuine equality of opportunity. The turning point had arrived, and there would be no going back to the old systems of quiet discrimination and unexamined bias. The conversation Marcus had never wanted to have was now being heard around the world, and its echoes would reshape the landscape of American education for generations to come. The earthquake that shook Whitmore University's foundations continued to send aftershocks through the American higher education system. Within 72 hours of David Thompson's devastating press conference, the institutional response had moved from crisis management to complete structural reorganization. President Victoria Harrison stood before a packed auditorium in Whitmore's main lecture hall, facing an audience that included faculty, students, alumni, board members, and national media representatives. The once confident administrator who had run the university for 8 years now appeared diminished, her usual authority replaced by visible uncertainty about her institution's future. "We gather today," President Harrison began, her voice carefully measured, "to address serious allegations about bias in our scholarship selection processes and to announce comprehensive reforms that will ensure Whitmore University lives up to its highest ideals of academic excellence and inclusive opportunity." The audience was skeptical. 3 days of damaging revelations had exposed not just the Pemberton Foundation incident, but a pattern of discriminatory practices that extended throughout the university's admissions, hiring, and academic programs. The Faculty Senate investigation had uncovered internal emails discussing cultural fit concerns about minority candidates, budget allocations that consistently underfunded diversity programs, and administrative policies that effectively maintained demographic exclusivity. Dr. Sarah Chen sat in the front row, having spent sleepless nights coordinating with faculty committees, student organizations, and external investigators to document the full scope of institutional bias at Whitmore. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "First," President Harrison continued, "I want to announce the immediate resignation of Dean of Admissions Richard Blackwood, along with his entire senior staff. The discriminatory practices documented in our scholarship selection processes are unacceptable and incompatible with our university's mission." The announcement drew mixed reactions. Some applauded the accountability measure, while others recognized it as the minimum possible response to mounting pressure. Dr. Blackwood's departure had been inevitable once his biased comments became public, but many questioned whether removing individuals would address systemic problems. "Additionally," President Harrison said, "we are dissolving the current structure of the Pemberton Foundation Scholarship Program and reconstituting it with new leadership, transparent criteria, and external oversight to ensure fair evaluation of all candidates." From his family's living room in Detroit, Marcus Thompson watched the press conference alongside his grandmother Ruby and his father, who had flown in from California to be present for this historic moment. Marcus felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that accountability was finally happening, but sadness that it had required such extreme circumstances to force institutional change. "How do you feel about all this?" Ruby asked her grandson, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I'm glad other students won't have to go through what I experienced, but I wish it hadn't taken a $50 million withdrawal to get their attention." David Thompson Sr. nodded grimly. "Sometimes institutions only respond to consequences they can't ignore. The financial pressure creates urgency that moral arguments alone couldn't achieve." President Harrison's announcement continued with a series of reform measures that represented the most comprehensive overhaul in Whitmore's modern history. A new chief diversity officer would be hired with unprecedented authority over admissions, faculty hiring, and academic programs. All scholarship and admissions committees would include external reviewers to prevent internal bias from influencing decisions. Mandatory training on implicit bias would be required for all faculty and staff members. Furthermore, President Harrison announced, Whitmore University commits to tripling our minority scholarship funding over the next 5 years, establishing partnerships with underserved high schools to identify talented students, and creating mentorship programs that support success for students from all backgrounds. The reforms were extensive, but many observers questioned whether they represented genuine change or strategic repositioning to limit further damage. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, watching from her EPA office in Washington, was cautiously optimistic but remained skeptical about implementation. "Policies are only as good as the people who execute them," Dr. Rodriguez told a colleague. "Whitmore is making promises now because they're under intense scrutiny, but sustaining this commitment will require ongoing vigilance." The most significant development came when President Harrison announced the establishment of the Whitmore Accountability Board, an independent oversight body composed of civil rights leaders, education experts, and community representatives who would monitor the university's progress and publish annual reports on diversity and inclusion metrics. This board will have full access to our admissions data, faculty hiring records, and institutional policies, President Harrison explained. Their role will be to ensure that our commitments to equity and inclusion are not just aspirational statements, but measurable outcomes. The announcement represented an unprecedented surrender of institutional autonomy. Universities typically guarded their internal processes jealously, but Whitmore was accepting external oversight as the price of rebuilding credibility. Meanwhile, across the country, the Marcus Thompson Foundation was moving from concept to reality with remarkable speed. David Thompson Sr. had assembled a team of educational experts, civil rights advocates, and technology leaders to design scholarship programs that would avoid the biases that had infected traditional systems. Dr. Keisha Williams, the renowned education researcher whom David had recruited to lead the foundation, was developing selection criteria based purely on merit indicators: academic achievement relative to available resources, innovation and creativity demonstrated through projects or research, leadership in addressing community challenges, and potential for positive social impact. "We're creating a model that other organizations can replicate," Dr. Williams explained during a television interview. "The goal isn't just to fund Marcus Thompson's education. It's to transform how talent is identified and nurtured across the entire educational system." The foundation's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of subjective evaluations of cultural fit or legacy connections, candidates would be assessed through blind review processes that focused exclusively on their achievements, potential, and commitment to using their education for positive social change. Applications for the foundation's first scholarship cycle were already pouring in from students across the country who had been overlooked or dismissed by traditional programs. The stories were heartbreaking and inspiring. Brilliant young people whose talents had been ignored because they didn't match demographic expectations or social profiles. Maria Santos continued her investigative reporting, uncovering similar patterns of bias at universities across the country. Her series, The Scholarship System, was revealing how discrimination operated at elite institutions nationwide, leading to calls for federal oversight of educational equity practices. "What happened at Whitmore isn't an isolated incident," Santos reported. "It's a symptom of systemic problems that affect thousands of deserving students every year. The question isn't whether bias exists, it's whether we're willing to confront it honestly and create genuine solutions." The Department of Education's investigation into Whitmore was proceeding rapidly, with federal investigators reviewing years of admissions and scholarship data to identify patterns of discrimination. Preliminary findings suggested violations of civil rights laws that could result in significant penalties and ongoing federal oversight. But perhaps the most powerful accountability came from students themselves. Campus demonstrations at Whitmore had evolved into organized advocacy efforts, with student leaders demanding not just policy changes, but cultural transformation that would make the university genuinely welcoming to people from all backgrounds. Jennifer Park, president of Whitmore's Student Government Association, became a national spokesperson for educational equity. "We're not just protesting Marcus Thompson's treatment," Park explained during a CNN interview. "We're demanding that our university become the inclusive institution it claims to be." The student movement had spread to dozens of other campuses, creating a national network of young activists committed to fighting discrimination in higher education. They were sharing resources, coordinating strategies, and holding their institutions accountable for genuine change rather than superficial reforms. At Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other elite universities, administrators were proactively reviewing their own policies and practices, hoping to avoid the kind of crisis that had engulfed Whitmore. The fear of public exposure and financial consequences was driving institutional soul-searching at unprecedented levels. Marcus found himself invited to speak at universities across the country, sharing his story and advocating for the kind of merit-based evaluation systems that the Marcus Thompson Foundation was pioneering. His presentations were drawing overflow crowds and standing ovations from students who saw him as a symbol of their own struggles against systemic barriers. "I never set out to become an activist," Marcus told an audience at Stanford University. "I just wanted to use my education to solve problems that matter. But I've learned that sometimes the most important problems are the systems that prevent talented people from getting opportunities they've earned." The speech was live-streamed to millions of viewers and shared across social media platforms, amplifying Marcus's message about the importance of genuine meritocracy in education. His calm, articulate advocacy was winning support from across the political spectrum, as people recognized the fundamental fairness of his position. Back at Whitmore, the practical effects of institutional change were becoming apparent. The university had launched a comprehensive review of every scholarship, admissions, and academic program, identifying and eliminating policies that created barriers for underrepresented students. Faculty hiring practices were being reformed to ensure diverse candidate pools and fair evaluation processes. Dr. Amanda Richards, who had sparked the initial accountability by speaking truthfully about the Pemberton Foundation's bias, was appointed to chair the new Faculty Diversity Committee. Her courage in exposing discrimination had cost her some relationships with colleagues, but it had also established her as a leader in institutional reform. Change is difficult and sometimes painful, Dr. Richards acknowledged during a faculty meeting, but it's also necessary and ultimately strengthening. We're becoming the university we should have been all along. The financial impact of quantum dynamics withdrawal continued to reverberate through Whitmore's operations. Budget cuts were affecting every department, forcing administrators to make difficult decisions about programs and personnel. But the crisis was also creating opportunities for innovation and efficiency that might not have emerged under normal circumstances. Some faculty members were discovering that institutional change, while disruptive, was also energizing. The conversations about bias and inclusion were forcing everyone to examine their own assumptions and practices, leading to improvements in teaching, research, and student support. President Harrison, meanwhile, was fighting for her professional survival. The Board of Trustees was divided about her leadership, with some members calling for her resignation while others argued that she should be given a chance to implement the reforms she had announced. Victoria has made mistakes, admitted Board Chair Margaret Patterson during a closed-door meeting. But removing her now might suggest that we're scapegoating individuals rather than addressing systemic problems. The question is whether she can lead the transformation we need. The debate reflected broader questions about accountability versus continuity that were playing out across the higher education sector. How much change was necessary? Who should be held responsible for past practices? What kind of leadership was needed for genuine reform? As the weeks passed, it became clear that the Marcus Thompson controversy had created irreversible momentum for change in American higher education. Universities could no longer operate with the assumption that their internal practices would remain private or unexamined. Students, faculty, donors, and government officials were demanding transparency and accountability at unprecedented levels. The story that had begun with one young man's disappointing scholarship interview had evolved into a national movement for educational equity. The systems that had excluded talented students for generations were finally facing sustained pressure for genuine reform. But the ultimate test would be whether these changes would endure once the immediate crisis passed, and whether the reforms would create lasting opportunities for the next generation of innovators, leaders, and problem solvers who deserved a chance to prove themselves regardless of their backgrounds or connections. The revolution in higher education was underway, and there was no turning back. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.